welcome into the Zoom room, everybody. I'll allow a couple of minutes, or no, not a couple of minutes, just 30 seconds or so as we have people enter the room and settle into this beautiful online environment that the team from Women's Health Loddon Mallee and our partners and our speakers have created here today to have a pretty incredible conversation. So as we enter into the room, I would just like to welcome you, but to also thank you for being here as part of our 16 Days of Activism campaign, where our focus is we can change the story, Loddon Mallee, choose respect. The conversation that will unfold today will be beautifully guided by the team here at Women's Health Loddon Mallee, and I will hand over to Women's Health Loddon Mallee's training and learning lead, Gabrielle Mentz, in a few moments. So before we do that, I just want to make sure that you're here at the right workshop or webinar, and that is preventing violence beyond the binary. A really important conversation and a very timely conversation for us to be all having at this moment. So as we begin, I would like to introduce myself. So I'm Kelly Dunn, the very, very proud and privileged CEO of Women's Health Loddon Mallee. You're going to meet some incredible members of our team today and our partners and speakers and community through the chat, etc., which the team will talk you through in a few moments. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we live, work and play. So we respect First Nations peoples and their enduring connection to country, to the land, air, waterways, oceans, animals and plants, and recognise the wisdom and culture that has seen them thrive for thousands of years. We also recognise at Women's Health Loddon Mallee that sovereignty was never ceded, and with humility and courage, wholeheartedly commit heads, hearts and hands to a path of healing, restitution and justice, embracing the wisdom of those who can guide us. And we will fulfil our responsibility with honesty and integrity, and we will challenge injustice. And in all of this, we will hold ourselves accountable. We would also like to honour that today is also the International Day of People with Disabilities. And so as part of this recognition, it is welcoming everybody into the room as you are, and to also know that this is a safe place for you to chat and to communicate with each other through the different platforms and mediums that we have. I did want to just highlight that the International Day of People with Disability is observed on December the 3rd every year, and that the theme for this year is fostering disability, inclusive societies for advancing social progress. So with that in mind, I feel like this is again just such an important conversation as we include intersectionality and the lens that we need to make sure that nobody gets left behind. So I would now like to hand over, first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that this is a shared event in partnership with Zoe Belle Gender Collective, Thorne, Harbour Country, Greater Bendigo Against Family Violence Network, and of course the City of Greater Bendigo. Without these partnerships, today's webinar would certainly not be as rich and inclusive and dynamic as it will be. So I would now like to hand over to your incredible MC for this event, Gabrielle Mentz, who, as I mentioned, is our Women's Health Loddon Mallee training and facilitation lead. Gabrielle, it's over to you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Hello, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. As Kelly said, I'm Gabrielle Mentz. I use she, her pronouns and the training and facilitation lead at Women's Health Loddon Mallee. And just to reiterate the very big welcome and thank you for being here for this important conversation on exploring what preventing gender-based violence beyond the binary means. And we've got a great lineup here today. We've got sector hot takes and resources to help you on your journey. But first, before we get into it, we've got some brief housekeeping. So in the chat, I've got my chat open. Tell us where you're from. Every year as we do this webinar, our reach grows and grows, and it's lovely to see where you're dialing in from today. Are you in the Loddon Mallee? Are you in Victoria? Where are you coming from? We love to hear. Surprise us. Oh my goodness. First cab off the rank, Perth. Did not see that one coming so immediately. That's amazing. Mildura, Hobart. Wow. Kyneton. See, Loddon Mallee is represented. Hindmarsh. Myrtleford. Oh, this is wonderful. Brisbane. This is excellent. This is so heartening. And this is something to bear in mind as we go through this, just how far and how many places people are interested in this messaging. There will be mention of violence against women and gender-based violence in this webinar. If you or someone you know requires support service details will be popped in the chat. And a big welcome on the screen. You can see our Auslan interpreter. So we'd like to welcome Therese Lewis and Georgia Knight from Auslan Services, who will be providing Auslan translation today. I am quite excited. Sorry, Therese. Hopefully I don't get too excited and talk too fast. And just a reminder for all our panelists as well. For those who need captions, look down at the bottom of your screen and there is a button that says Show Captions. Click that button and the words should pop up on your screen. Also, we've got a jam-packed 90 minutes. There are no scheduled breaks, so please take one as needed. If you're in any doubt, I would go so that you don't miss out on anything. Throughout the event, please pop any questions you may have in the Q&A window. We will try to answer them all, but if time doesn't allow for that, we will follow up when we send you resources after the event. You will get a post email with important links and some answers to questions. And this is a webinar about respect. You can see behind me, it says choose respect. So just a reminder, we're here to build respect and equality and have zero tolerance for any disrespectful comments in the chat. They will be dealt with. Now, first, the lineup today, we've switched it up a little bit. First, we will have a panel discussion with our 3 guest speakers. And then Starlady will finish with an overview of how transmisogyny and transphobia relate to gender-based violence prevention, an overview of her work, and some top tips and actions for you moving forward beyond this webinar. All right. So we do love a chatty crowd here at Women's Health Loddon Mallee, so show your love and support and questions in the chat and Q&A. And without further ado, let's get started. Now, starting on a more somber note, if anyone is struggling with the global climate right now, the rise of extreme politics, the violence, the backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion, you are not alone. And like Kelly said, this is a safe space for us to come together and learn. With this climate and this backlash, gender-based violence is increasing, not only globally, but here in our hometowns. This is happening to women. This is happening in LGBTQIT communities, and violence against trans and gender diverse folk is increasing. Now, hundreds of you registered for this webinar. Look at the chat where everyone is from. And by the way, you still got time to put your hometown in the chat if you were on the fence about it. We love to hear. So all of these places that you've put where you're dialing in from today, these are places on the map where people care and want to know what they can do. And together, we show up and find out how we, individually, but also in our workplaces, can do something about preventing gender-based violence. Another shout out from Mildura. That's wonderful. Many of us in the room, and certainly here at Women's Health Loddon Mallee, have a history with preventing violence against women. And we acknowledge that we stand on the shoulders of giants who have fought for the safety of women. We acknowledge the great work that they have done, and we are thankful. But in all good conscience, we cannot focus on the safety of women alone. At Women's Health Loddon Mallee, we are on a learning journey. We don't claim to have gotten it right. We're still learning as we go, but we are not going to let our fears get in the way. We're challenging our biases, and we're challenging our understanding of the issue and figuring things out. We are rethinking the language we use to be truly inclusive, because language is important. And in the words of Rainbow Health's inclusive language tip sheet that you're going to get today, and would have been emailed to you before the session, they said, when the language and evidence we use only references the experiences of straight and cisgendered people, this can make it harder for LGBTIQ people to recognize violence and find support. The process, the conversation may feel uncomfortable, it may feel challenging to you, and we hope that you can work through that with us, ask questions, and begin. Don't wait. If there's one thing this webinar can do for you today, is to give permission to broaden your practice and understanding of what preventing violence beyond the binary is. For one thing, it is not a separate issue, it's not an add-on. The safety of the LGBTIQ community, particularly the trans and gender diverse folk right now, is imperative for a healthy and thriving community. Why? Because homophobia and trans misogyny are fueled by the same issues that sexism and misogyny towards women are. And our panelists today will explore how feminism and LGBTQIA+ rights intersect. And speaking of our panelists, I think it's time to introduce them. And your questions, start thinking about your questions and put them in the Q&A. All right, so first up, I'd love to introduce Starlady, who uses she, her pronouns. Starlady is a queer trans woman, feminine person living on Dja country and is the director at the Zoe Belle Gender Collective. She is passionate about social justice, the prevention of gender-based violence, and dismantling trans misogyny. Starlady is the lead author and campaign director of TransFem, a campaign and website promoting healthier relationships between trans women and cis men. And you can see Starlady's background has got the TransFem and behind her with Zoe Belle Gender Collective. So we encourage you to go and have a look at those. Next up, we've got Julia Earley, she, her. Julia is the Senior Coordinator, Family Violence Prevention at Rainbow Health Australia and leads their Pride in Prevention project. Her work addresses evidence, policy, and practice gaps and supports sector capacity building to effectively prevent and respond to family violence experienced by LGBTIQI+ communities. Julia also develops and delivers training in LGBTIQ+ affirmative personal practice for health and community service providers, and she has extensive experience across the family violence and gender equity sectors with a focus on workforce development. Welcome, Julia. And then our third panelist for today is Ellen Poyner, she, her. Ellen Poyner is Portfolio Manager for Innovation at Our Watch, where she oversees evidence-building projects focused on preventing violence against women and LGBTIQA+ communities. Ellen is passionate about driving systems-level change through inclusive, community-led approaches that center lived experience and equity. With deep expertise in evidence-based program design and strategy, Ellen's work aims to create lasting impact across diverse communities. Welcome, Ellen. It's so lovely to have all three of you here, and we've got so many questions for you today. I hope we can get into them all and have some great conversations. Now, the first question that comes to mind when I think about the title of this webinar, Preventing Violence Beyond the Binary, I think we have to sort of go back to basics and the foundations. And the question is, well, first of all, what is the binary narrative and how does it do harm? And I think we'll start off with you, Starlady. Can you answer that?
I think for trans and gender diverse people, the binary narrative. First of all, I just want to start off by acknowledging today I'm coming from Jaja Wurrung country, and I just like to put out the solidarity that First Nations communities are also being impacted by sort of like backlash and colonialism, and standing in solidarity with like other communities who are also like impacted, including migrants in Australia, and people who might be refugees and asylum seekers. And just to point out that, intersectionality is a really key part of gender-based violence work. But for trans and gender diverse communities, I think the sort of binary narrative means that trans and gender, we've really been thinking within the sort of prevention sector, that it has been around cisgender men's violence against cisgender women. And, that's really important and pivotal work that we can sort of build upon. But what it has meant is that trans and gender diverse communities and broadly LGBTI communities have been left behind. And this has caused harm to our communities. I think, Gabrielle, you were just talking about how some of that means that often that our communities may not be able to identify the violence that they're experiencing. Also, in my work on the sort of trans femme project, one of the things, really sort of key learnings I have was when I was working on an Our Watch project, and one of the trans ladies who's, was a trans woman of color, and she was talking about how, when she's dating men quite often didn't know that she had a trans experience or that she was a trans woman. And when she disclosed this to, some of her male partners, all of a sudden they didn't feel like they needed to treat her with the same level of respect as they treating cisgender women. And so when we have these narratives around, just solely focusing on men's violence against, cis women or respecting cis women solely, it just means that some of our communities, are being left behind. And it's also resulted in a service system where even though trans and gender diverse people experience incredibly high rates of intimate partner violence and family violence, it is very hard for us to be able to access the supports for victims of violence because we've been excluded from those sorts of narratives. Or if I broadly look, like just recently, I went to a big the Stop Domestic Violence conference, where I was a keynote speaker at that event, and there were hundreds of services all across Australia. And I was talking in particular about men's violence against trans women. And I asked everybody in the room, can you please put up your hand if in your organization you employ a single trans woman? And across the sort of things, only about two services, which were the LGBTI services, put up their hands. And it just sort of like talks about in prevention and within sort of family-based violence services that you don't see many trans and gender diverse people employed. And I think that creates a sort of like inequity. And what also means that like trans and gender diverse communities, who I think we're very passionate, about ending sort of gender-based violence, that we are not resourced to be able to participate within this sector. There. Thank you.
Thank you. And just there's a lot of love for you in the chat as well. People really love your resources and your work. So just some key points there about sort of not getting the support needed, but also sort of unpacking where that discrimination starts. And I think that's something we're going to tease out a little bit more as we go through this. Julia, did you have anything to add to the binary?
Yes, yeah, happy to jump in there. Thank you, Starlady. And thanks for about the lack of trans women employed in the sector. And I think it's a good question for the women's sector to ask ourselves about how we're reinforcing this idea about what a real woman is through continuing to predominantly, almost entirely employ cis women. Yeah, I thought I would try. I know it can be helpful to have this explained in different ways, and so I think it's useful for us all to kind of explain it in different ways. And so I wanted to kind of go back to like, what does this binary narrative mean, and answer it as simply as I can. And I guess I understand it as this idea that there are only two genders and that this is based on biology. So you're born, a doctor takes a look between your legs and assigns you into the box, girl or boy, and then you become woman or man. And this idea is utterly pervasive, particularly in our Western colonial culture. And I would note that many cultures have always understood that this is not true, although colonialism has had its best crack at disrupting that. So we see this everywhere. And the problem with this system is that there are these really rigid and strict ideas about what you're supposed to do in order to fulfill your duty as being this man or being this woman, like really strict expectations of how you'll dress, how you'll behave, who you'll date, what kind of job you can do, who you're going to be attracted to. And so this kind of two-box system, it's another way of saying rigid gender stereotypes, rigid gender norms. The man box is another way of saying this. So this is kind of, this is not a new language to say binary narrative. There's lots of different ways of explaining this, lots of different jargon, but what it's essentially kind of boiling down to is this idea that there are two gender boxes only, which for the record is patently untrue. And the thing is that one of the core expectations, or the core gender expectations of these two roles, is that these two boxes are designed to go together, right? Where they're supposed to date only each other, and they're supposed to procreate, and of course they're hierarchical. The idea that men are more dominant and women are more submissive. What's also unspoken is that those people, you're supposed to be able-bodied. And so thank you for the shout out for International Day of People with Disabilities. Really important for us to continue to think about how the intersections with our work. And so what's really important to say about this binary gender system is that it impacts everybody. I invite everyone, including cisgender people, to think about how you've felt limited by the expectations that are placed on you because of the box that you were put into, right? So there are specific and unique ways that LGBTIQ people and trans and gender diverse people in particular are harmed by this system, but it really does impact everyone. And we're all limited by the restrictions placed on us in this kind of binary system, and so this binary system creates a culture that normalizes violence of anybody who strays against anybody who strays outside of the expectations placed on them, and I guess how that creates harm, particularly for LGBTIQ plus people, is that we see worse outcomes from physical and mental health, housing, maintaining employment, difficulties with alcohol and other drugs, and it's really important to note that this is because of systemic barriers, not we need to be really careful not to pathologize when we're thinking about these poorer outcomes that occur because our entire kind of social, medical, legal systems are all set up to reinforce this kind of two-box rigid gender system. So I hope that helps.
That does. There's a lot to unpack there. Just almost seeming like an arbitrary way, this massive weight of expectations is put upon us, and the way that it filters through our individual relationships, our community, our workplaces, our laws, our structures is quite something to unpack. And I just love, we've already had a hot tip for this webinar is hire more trans women or trans people or gender diverse folk. That is key. Ellen, I'm sure you've got your own hot take on the binary narrative and the harm that it does. Can you share?
Yeah, thanks, Gabrielle, Starlady, and Julia. I think, I guess part of what I wanted to say was really just reiterating like Starlady's lead in about like the harm that the exclusion from national frameworks, from primary prevention frameworks, from government policy documents to date that's caused. And we've really heard this reflected back to us in this key piece of work that we're doing with Rainbow Health Australia, developing a new national framework. We've been this year engaging nationally across the country with LGBTIQ organisations, but with other prevention people doing prevention work through NGOs and in the various settings where we all work. And, you know, that was really one of the key findings. And so we're, you know, really pleased to be doing this work with Rainbow Health Australia to partner to develop a first national violence prevention framework, because you know, it's one of those steps towards, you know, addressing that exclusion, which we know has caused incredible harm. So yeah, just really wanted to reiterate that.
Exciting news. You heard it here. We're looking forward to that. But getting back to this binary narrative and the harm that it causes, thanks, Ellen, for your insights. What is the connection then with feminism? What is the connection with rights for women and rights for LGBTIQ plus people? How does it intersect? How can we explain to people that it's not a separate issue or an add-on? How can we see the connection, spell it out for people? We'll go back to you, Starlady, again with that question.
Can I throw to Julia first?
Oh, sure.
And I'll go.
That was
Sure. How do LGBTIQA rights and cis women's rights intersect and align? I think to begin with, the rights of both of these groups of people share the right to be free from discrimination and violence and gender-based violence. And so we define gender-based violence as including violence against LGBTIQA plus people. And the reason for that is that what sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia all have in common is that ultimately they boil down to this kind of this two-box system, this idea that the body that you're born with defines many things about your life and what's expected of you. And so at its core, these different forms of gender-based harassment and violence, they all share that. So it's at the core, it's really the same. We have a shared problem, and therefore we also have the possibility for and actually the compulsion for a shared solution. I think it does also bear articulating that women and LGBTIQ plus people are not separate groups. In fact, I'm a bisexual cisgender woman, so I'm in both of those groups. There's like an overlap in the Venn. But there are also a number of things that these kind of groups of people share, which is, and one example where I think it's really obvious is bodily autonomy. So women have long fought for the right to reproductive control, and intersex people are long fighting for the rights. And great news in Victoria yesterday that there'll be restrictions on surgeries performed on intersex babies, which is amazing. Trans and gender diverse people accessing medical affirmation, medical gender affirmation. Also, bodily autonomy is a huge thing for the disability community. So there are a lot of overlaps here. So we share a lot of the same, fights, because we share the same rights that we have had denied, and that continually come under attack. I think I'd also say that rights and LGBTIQ plus rights often face a lot of backlash, and it's often from the same actors, from the same conservatives who they're seeing the connection between these issues, right? And so we could take this one lesson from them in understanding the connection between them, even if we don't take any other lessons from them. So like those who are fighting abortion rights are also fighting trans rights, for example. I think the thing is also that violence perpetrated against LGBTIQ plus people is often by those who are outside of our communities. And so for that reason, it's really important that mainstream organisations are proactive in including LGBTIQ plus people in their prevention efforts. And maybe we'll get into this a bit more as the discussion goes, but the power of partnerships between LGBTIQ organisations and women's organisations, we've really seen a lot in the last couple of years. which which has been really exciting to see. But I'll let Starlady speak, and we can talk about that a bit more.
Thanks, Julia. I just want to be really clear that trans and gender diverse rights and women's rights like intersect. Like ZGBC comes from an intersectional feminist perspective, but we're often like sold in the media or by politicians that women's rights and trans and gender diverse rights are mutually exclusive. But the reality on the ground is that our organizations are working together to end gender-based violence. Our biggest supporters are organizations like Women's Health, Loddon, Mallee, Women's Health in the North. We're working with Respect Victoria. We're working with like Our Watch. We're working with like organizations like No to Violence. We're deeply embedded, and that they support us, and that our work is building on top of the incredible like history and legacy of that sort of like sector. But you were being sold this really sort of like false sort of narrative, and it's this idea of like there's, I guess, a co-option of feminist sort of language and activism that's using this idea of sort of like women's safety to attack many different communities, in particular trans and gender diverse communities. And the success of this, then they don't stop just attacking like transphobia and transmisogyny. You know, transmisogyny is the intersection of transphobia and misogyny that impact trans women and trans feminine people, are some of the most socially forms of discrimination. We've sort of in our movements, we've sort of like ignored it or haven't addressed it. And what this has done, it's sort of like created areas where it's easy for people who are anti-rights movements to use these things to then reinforce rigid gender norms and dominant forms of masculinity. And for example, in the US, when they started taking away trans and gender diverse people's rights to access care or to access gender affirming care, they didn't stop at us. The next thing in this movement was they went and, attacked women's bodily autonomy and the right to access abortion. We've seen in the UK very sort of successful sort of co-option of sort of like this ideas of women's safety to remove trans and gender diverse people's rights. But now that same framework is being used to sort of support sort of racist, anti-migrant sort of attitudes where they're using this idea of women's safety to attack and to harm other people. And I think in our prevention work, we have to think very strategically how we sort of like take back that language or how we challenge these sorts of narratives, because they are very sort of like intertwined. And yeah, and it's really sort of like pivotal that we sort of prop up, areas where that we might have, around sort of like heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and racism and ableism. Because if we leave anyone behind, in our movements, I think that's where it creates risk for them taking away all of our rights.
Thank you. And thanks both of you for sort of really highlighting those shared aspects like bodily autonomy and how that impacts different communities. That's really strong. And also just the impact of collective action and working with multiple partners and organizations to achieve these goals. That's great. But I'm wondering, like words like when you say cisnormativity and heteronormativity, some people may not be familiar with those words. We did send out a glossary before this session, but just to sort of help people get their heads around these concepts, just how exactly, when we look at heteronormativity and cisnormativity and those expectations, how does it shape societal attitudes towards masculinity, for instance? And in what way do they contribute to patterns of men's violence against women, trans, and gender diverse people? And I'll let you nominate who wants to jump in on that one. So just unpacking those concepts and how they shape masculinity and the impact on men's violence towards these groups.
I'm happy to start. Starlady or Ellen, feel free to jump in. I think, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of jargon, a lot of big words, and I think hiding behind big, complicated words are actually really quite simple concepts. And this really what the impact on masculinity. Basically, the idea is that a real man is one who is tough, who is in control, who does not cry, who does not express emotions, and this is the behavior that we reward in boys and adolescent men and in men. And so that's a direct pipeline to violence. We're rewarding the behaviors that are the precursor to violence. And so if a man ever is like crying or sharing his feelings, doing something like that, he'll be told either, oh, you're being a girl or you're gay. And so we've kind of the homophobia and misogyny are kind of two sides of the same coin there. You know, both are not what a real man is supposed to be. And so like if you picture like a boy in the schoolyard who's being bullied, the boy who's being the bully is doing who's punishing the boy who's, you know, crying or something. He's doing exactly what he's been told he's supposed to do, and he is just pushing this boy back into his box. He's been given the social permission to police his peers into a certain form of behavior, and so taking away the box then is not only is that better for everyone because we're removing the restrictions, but it's taking away of violence itself. And so this, I guess the other important point here is that this is often how men bond, is through sexist, transphobic, homophobic jokes, hate speech, this kind of thing. And so, yeah, maybe I'll leave it there.
Ellen, it's your turn.
Thanks, Starlady. It actually prompted me to reflect on some work that I was engaged with a few years back at Drummond Street Services, which is around the transition to parenthood, which I think, there were, you know, many learnings in relation to the transition to parenthood for LGBTIQ parents and how that's related to experiences through the, you know, that perinatal service system is related, you know, strongly to cis-normativity and heteronormativity. And so, you know, the importance in through a primary prevention lens in challenging norms around families being formed with two parents, a mother and a father, and those expectations around, you know, masculinity in that time of life where we have workplace cultures that expect a primary and a secondary parent, and that you know, and there's a hierarchy between them, and that the you know, secondary parent is in the workplace, you know, bringing in the money, and so there's these expectations around birthing parents identifying as mothers and being cisgender. So there is, I was thinking about these opportunities across the life course as well, that where we see heightened risk of family violence, but also are really at times to challenge those embedded norms, and one of those being, you know, the transition to parenthood.
Thanks, Ellen. Starlady, you've got your chance now.
Yeah. And so one of the things, I mean, recently there's been some really exciting research that's come out through the Jesuit Social Services and their man box research. And one of the pillars in their research is like sort of how heteronormativity sort of is reinforced within our society by both men and women. And so some of the stats that came out of that, they asked young men a series, and young women a series of questions. And one of those questions was a good way to see manly is not to act gay. And 47% of young men personally endorse that, but also to recognize 30% of cisgender women endorse that. Another piece of the sort of research that was asked was teenage boys should never act like a girl, and that was 47% of young boys and 24% of young women. So it talks about how, yes, these attitudes are like, it's nearly half of young men who believe and endorse these attitudes, but it's up to a quarter or a third of young women. And so I think we need to be really aware that these attitudes just don't exist with young men. They also exist with young women. And so how do we change their attitudes? And so in that, I'm sort of always reflecting around what does this mean? I do a lot of work, obviously, around addressing men's violence against trans women. And so sort of like how heteronormativity impacts their relationships is what it is that men, in our society, there's an incredible pressure to be like heterosexual, be a heterosexual man and to only be attracted to heterosexual cisgender women. And so what it does is it creates this incredible amount of shame for men who are attracted to or sometimes in relationships with trans women. And that shame can really drive violence against sort of trans women. It sort of results in issues where like often sometimes men might hide their relationships with trans women, where those relationships might only ever come within the sort of like their privacy of their own home. And so this is how heteronormativity can drive violence against communities. It also means things like men are deprioritizing their relationships with trans women because their family, their friends, or their ex-girlfriend, doesn't support their relationships with trans women. And so this also leads to sort of men where it's like you're trans women not worthy of a relationship. And so they begin to see them only as sort of like sexual, objects. And so this leads to the fetishization, objectification, or sexual exploitation of trans women. But if their friends, families, and communities supported their relationships with trans women, those relationships would be much more likely to be long-lasting and to be healthy. I think it also talks to this, like, there's a very narrow sort of like acceptance or limitations and understanding around men's sexuality, and that men's sexuality is actually much more incredibly diverse than what we think. Like we know in research, it's much more likely that that cisgender women are more likely or more accepting of sort of identifying as bisexual, while men, the sort of statistics are low. And because it's not because like men mightn't be attracted to other men, but there's much more sort of shame and taboo around it. And so this leads to like in the LGBTI sector, where we're often talking about men who have sex with men. And if we sort of like support men to be able to be able to explore and express their sexuality in healthy ways, we're going to create a much more healthy society. I also think I want to acknowledge the sort of like increasing violence that we're seeing against gay and bisexual men through dating apps. And so there has now been a number of like arrests, and like I think it's like quite significant amounts of gay men have been attacked on dating apps, where sort of men or young men in particular have been using dating apps to attack gay or bisexual men, to film it and then to share that with other men. And this is how we're seeing this, like they're reinforcing socially dominant forms of activity by being violent and attacking gay men. And just as trans women, it's really important. We understand what violence is like. We experience a lot of violence in our lives, and I just want to show my solidarity there. Thank you.
Just a brief add on there, Starlady, what was something that I think can help people understand how gender is at the heart of all these different forms of violence is if you think about the fact that most, I mean, I don't know if there's ever been a study or something, but I think if you ask most men, including cisgender straight men, if they've ever been called a homophobic slur, you would probably get an incredibly high rate of cis straight men who've been on the receiving end of homophobic slurs or homophobic violence. And so I guess that's how you could see that it's not really about the man's sexuality or entirely, because he may not actually be gay or bi or queer, but it comes back to the fact that he's not performing masculinity in the appropriate way. And so I think if that's helpful for people in kind of seeing the consistent point there about gender, rigid gender.
Thanks, both of you. I think you've both highlighted the importance of breaking down the boxes. I think you said take away the box, Julia, and just the harm that comes from those expectations and from shame when you're not meeting those rigid expectations, the sort of knock-on effect that that has. So for this last bit of our panel discussion, the burning question is like we see what creates gender-based violence. What can we do? What can we do about this to stop it? So I think we'll throw this question to you, Ellen. You've mentioned this new framework coming in partnership with Our Watch and Rainbow Health Australia. How does this framework differ from existing prevention resources, and what gaps is it aiming to fill?
Gabrielle. And I just really wanted to start this by like echoing what you said at the start about the work that this framework and indeed all of the work that we're talking about today builds on, because yeah, it's really important as a mainstream organisation, speaking today to honour the decades of activism and advocacy that has really been led by, LGBTIQ rights and women's rights activists for generations, and that all of those things have created the condition for this new piece of work that we're working on to make this framework possible. So we're, I guess, just really deeply mindful that this is part of a much bigger story of social change that everybody's speaking about today, and much of that has been led by LGBTIQ communities. So yes, as you have mentioned and I've kind of alluded to, we're developing a new national framework in partnership with Rainbow Health Australia, and acknowledging Julia on this panel today and all of her colleagues and the leadership in LGBTIQ primary prevention that exists within Rainbow Health Australia and other obviously key organisations like Zoe Belle Gender Collective. So this work that we're doing is funded under the second national plan, and it really builds on Rainbow Health's pride in prevention evidence resources, which are just like exemplary resources that offer so much in this space around programming and evaluation and messaging and partnership. So the work is aiming to build on that had a focus on family violence prevention and to elevate the work to be considering all forms of violence against LGBTIQ communities, and really building on the strength of that suite of resources to engage with a national audience, to have input from people all around the country, and to really aims to build a deeper understanding of the drivers of violence against LGBTIQ people and what works to prevent it. I think I've lost the first part of the question, but one of the people, for some, I'm recognising that there's people here from all different contexts. Some may be, wondering, what is this national framework? The resource itself, and alongside similar national resources and frameworks that we've developed, are deliberately quite high level. So they aim to give us a shared national vision and language across sectors, and it's delightful to hear that there are so many people from across the country here today and across sectors, and we know that there is pockets of real strength for this work around the country, and then there are other areas where we're hoping to strengthen and to help give that shared language, clear principles, and really importantly, those evidence-based drivers and actions that can guide all of our work, which will allow for flexibility for communities to adapt approaches locally. And ultimately, the goal is to support more people to understand and take action to prevent violence against LGBTIQ people and communities, and guide and coordinate that prevention work at a national level. Julia, you might have other things that you'd like to add from your perspective at Rainbow Health.
I guess maybe now is a good chance to just like, I guess, reflect briefly on the kind of the context that we're operating in at the moment. And I would say that I mean, there is incredible escalating backlash globally against, which has been referred to earlier. And we are fortunate in Australia that we do not have a women's movement also contributing to that in the way that there is in other places around the world. And that the women's sector in Victoria has largely, especially in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, like really, really shifted and come on board with supporting a more inclusive way of doing violence prevention work, which is really exciting. And the fact that we are at the point where we're developing a national framework is huge, and really, like 5 years ago was really hard to imagine. And so I think that it really speaks to the power of the partnership that's been happening across our sectors, and all of our organisations here are involved in different iterations of those partnerships. And I think it's worth saying we still have a long way to go, and that's by virtue of the fact that for many, many years the LGBTIQ communities were left out of of mainstream prevention efforts, but it is shifting. And historically, it was really seen as a bit of a zero-sum game, that to be preventing violence against LGBTIQ people was seen as somehow taking away from preventing violence against women, against cisgender heterosexual women. And that is really I would say, the old way of thinking in the sector now. And that's incredibly exciting to me, to see that there has been growing understanding and curiosity and willingness to learn. And that really, it feels like the future. I feel really excited to think about 5 years from now where we might be at, in terms of, how much has shifted in even just in the last 5 years. And so if you feel like you're still new at trying to grapple with all this and understand it, that's okay. The framework isn't even out yet, right? Like, all the work that's been happening already is fantastic, and has been able to happen due to, people bravely kind of bumbling along and having a go, and not always getting it right, but learning from the mistakes that they've made. And when the framework comes out next year, it's gonna, I guess the invitation is to get excited about it, read it, share it with your colleagues, like have a think about how it can be applied in your work. I guess, like, we're not the queer police here to kind of tell you off for getting it wrong. We really want everyone to be engaging. And it's amazing that you've chosen to come to this event today. Keep showing up to work events like this. Just talk about doing inclusive prevention work as part of the conversations that you have wherever you're doing gender equity and prevention work. Ask people what they're doing. Talk about what you're trying, what you're thinking about. I think just we don't have. I guess just, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And I think the context of the global backlash, what it really tells us is that everybody needs to be saying something, because I guess silence is complicity, to flip it the other way. And so any attempts that you're making to be more inclusive in the work that you're doing are going to be really noticed and appreciated by LGBTIQ communities. I would say that that's kind of, where it's that backlash is escalating backlash, as people have said. There is escalating violence in this country. We're not immune to it here. And so, I guess good opportunity to make your position clear.
Thanks, Julia. I love what you said there. And again, with that sort of, permission to be curious and try and give it a go, and that don't let perfect be the enemy of good or change. That's really great. And you at Rainbow Health have just released a wonderful resource that can help people with that worry about perfection, which is the inclusive language tip sheets. You would have had that email to you, and Karine has put it in the chat as well. So if someone, an organization, is picking up those inclusive language tip sheets, and they're feeling a bit nervous, what words of encouragement can you give them to take those resources and use them effectively?
Did you want me to respond to that?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, well, there's two guides, and one is about use the language itself and what you some considerations for the language that you're using. And the other is about supporting you to have the conversations within your organizations to advocate for that language. And that's because we know that often people don't understand, which is, understandable because of the binary narrative and how deeply it has permeated everything, including our sector. And so understandably, people don't always understand. But then if you are wanting to use more inclusive language in your organization, there can often be some resistance, and so the second tip sheet is really to support you to prepare for those conversations, to go in kind of as ready as possible, and with some different strategies about how you might have those conversations to be doing that work advocating internally. And I guess what the tip sheets are not is a definitive guide of what term you should always use when. And it's people often are coming to us at Rainbow Health wanting to know which gender options should we have in our drop-down form, and people want really specific advice. And unfortunately, we can't always be that specific because the context is going to influence so much of what's going to be the best choice. But what it does have is some overarching principles to help you to apply to the work that you're doing. And I don't think that anything else exists that does quite what this does. And so I guess, yeah, I would pair those tip sheets with the invitation to give it a go, and know that you will learn from your efforts of doing it. And I would say that the best way to make sure that you're getting your messaging right is to work with LGBTI organizations and your community members and the people that your messaging is for. The more that you can have involvement from the communities that you're talking about, the stronger and more effective your messaging and your language is going to be.
That's wonderful. Give it a go. Liaise with relevant organizations. Get started. We've got a couple of minutes left before we go into our keynote speaker, Starlady. Did you want to talk about your wealth of resources that you've got before we do that? Are you going to wait till the session? All right. Now, just before we head into that, just to invite the audience again, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. I don't know if you've been so engrossed in what everyone has had to say that no questions have come yet. So here's your chance. So while we're waiting for any questions that may come through, let's have a wrap-up comment before we move into the Q&A. We'll start with you, Starlady.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with what Julia said, that as a trans and gender diverse organization, sometimes people are really nervous about doing this work. They're worried about mistakes. And I just want to be really clear. We are asking you to work alongside us and to work with us and to do this work. It's okay if you make mistakes. What's important is that there's good intentions and that you can always develop your practice and to learn more. But we really want to empower you to be doing this work and to be working alongside us. Thank you.
Thank you. Julia.
What was the question? Sorry, Gab.
Just any final...
One final tip.
Wow.
I think the phrase that comes to mind is get your house in order. I think that often if you're part of a big organization or even a small organization and you're in one tiny pocket trying to do violence prevention work that's more inclusive, it's going to be really hard to do that if the rest of your organization hasn't at all thought about LGBTIQA inclusion. And so it's really important that alongside your violence prevention work, that your organization is thinking about broader inclusion work. And training is a really good place to start. We offer training, as do Zoe Belle Gender Collective and many other organizations. Can be a really great way to just support everyone in your organization to improve their general knowledge. And I guess really good inclusion work will contribute to your prevention work, and any really effective violence prevention work will be inclusive. Like organization-wide inclusion work is a form of prevention because you're addressing things like homophobia, transphobia in systems in your organization, in the workplace as a setting. So it is a form of prevention in and of itself. And so, like at Rainbow Health, we've written the Rainbow Tick standards, which are one kind of framework to work towards. You can work towards your Rainbow Tick accreditation or not even necessarily do that, and we provide a whole lot of support and resources for organisations doing that. So I think what it will also do is helps build trust. If you're wanting to approach local LGBTIQ orgs to work on your violence prevention work together, if you've shown that you've done a bit of work internally to help get your house in order, that's going to really help to build trust externally. So that's something to think about.
That's great. And Ellen, over to you for the final.
Thank you. I think we've heard, and importantly so, about like the importance of inclusion work, obviously in all of our mainstream settings, and just really want to echo that. And I guess the other point, the piece that we really want to advocate for is LGBTIQ-led organisations like Zoe Belle Gender Collective and others, many around the country, leading their own work, and our role as mainstream organisations in promoting and supporting and finding ways to elevate that community-led work that they drive, which you're doing today by putting this on. But there are many other ways to do this, like accessing training, as Julia said, or sharing campaigns on social media, or linking these organisations and advocates to philanthropists or funders in our regions. They're just really wanted to end by saying well done to you for doing this, and also encouraging others to do this in their space as well.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm just having a look. There's something's come up. There's a comment, Starlady, I really resonate with your comment about homophobic language and prejudice used by straight cis women towards men. It's something that is not often called out, and I think that's part of the uncomfortable work in this sort of hearing those kind of comments. So thank you. And there's another one. We've been trying to figure out some acronyms in the chat. So there was a question about, is there any good work on RJ, TJ in queer communities? And we're thinking perhaps it's restorative justice or transformative justice. Did anyone be able to answer that question? That perhaps is out of the scope for right now, but we will put our heads together over that and think about an answer in a follow-up email. I'd like to hand over, but before I hand over to Starlady, just a big thank out for the, sorry, I'm losing my words already. A big thank you to the three of you for answering those questions and giving us some really good insights and great tips moving forward, particularly that permission to start. So thank you, Julia, from Rainbow Health Australia. Thank you for all the wonderful resources that Rainbow Health Australia provides us. We're very grateful for them. And thank you, Ellen Poyner from Our Watch, for coming on today and sharing the exciting work that is happening at Our Watch in partnership with Rainbow Health Australia. And thank you, Starlady. We are going to hand over to you for our final presentation.
Sorry, I was having some tech issues. Excellent, everyone. Hey, thank you. I'm going to be talking to you around some sort of quick tips on allyship and inclusion for trans and gender diverse people, sort of in prevention and sort more broadly. Some of this might be, be able to relate to you in and around gender equality action plans or gender impact assessments, or also sort of like prevention of violence. Great. And so ZGBC has produced like a whole sort of series of resources that you can access on our website. And some of those resources are around like trans and gender diverse people and sex and consent. I think it's really important when we're thinking about violence prevention. We're also thinking about the prevention of sexual-based violence. And we have our resources, Gender Euphoria and Sex, which is for trans and gender diverse people around sex and consent. But we also produced a resource for the partners of trans and gender diverse people called Gender Diversity, Sex and Consent. And this was really based upon, I guess, some of our original work in addressing men's violence against trans women, where many members of our community were like, it's really amazing that you've produced this very specific resource, but we've read it and we think it's really exciting. Can you translate some of the learnings for us for the broader trans and gender diverse community? And so we've done that. I just want to be really clear. ZGBC is not uptight about intellectual property. What we want is that these resources are out there. We want you to learn from those resources. You can quote from those resources. You can put them up on your sort of like website. It's just really important that we get out there. Our main concern is ending violence against trans and gender diverse people, and also that trans and gender diverse people have a right to access healthy relationships. So we've also produced a number of resources that was being supported by Rainbow Health Australia called Transfem. And one, we've got like a website, transfem.com.au, and that is sort of a community resource. It's a prevention resource, and it has resources for trans women around healthy relationships with men. It has resources for cisgender men about how to have relationships with trans women. But we also have information for men's family, friends, and broader community. And that's because we really know that the relationships between trans women and men are much more likely to be healthy and long-lasting when their friends, family, and community support them. Also on the Transfem website, we've got a new page that's for practitioners. And in that we have like the Transfem practitioner guides, which talks about the sort of frameworks and how you might put into practice some of the work about addressing men's violence against trans women. We also have a whole series of webinars that we've produced. We've seen things like Our Watch, who really excitingly put some of our Transfem webinars up on their sort of learning platforms. And I really encourage you to take our resources and embed them across your organization, including your learning platforms. But we've also like to acknowledge that there's so much out there, including like Rainbow Health Australia Pride and Prevention series that you can access on their website as well. I think in doing some of the work and beginning to understand the sort of like global backlash and the increasing attacks on trans and gender diverse people, it's really important to understand what's going on. And there's some really exciting organizations called the Trans Justice Project that I really encourage you to support and to follow. They've done a really great report called Fueling Hate that just sort of like talks about and creates the evidence base to talk about the increasing levels of like anti-trans hate, violence and discrimination. And in combating these sort of like the myths and misinformation that's sort of growing and out there, they've got really great resources on disinformation and misinformation and how you might sort of like combat that. But there's a whole sort of CGBC small, we've got like 2 staff and a board. And so we're a small organization. We've got a large sort of reach, but we're very sort of like underfunded. But there's a number of other trans and gender diverse organizations that you can follow, including Transgender Victoria, and Transcend. And locally here in Bendigo, we've got trans and gender diverse Bendigo and beyond. And so all of you, wherever you are, you're going to have local trans organisations, and it's really important you connect with them, you form authentic relationships with those communities, and you help platform them, and you help build up their sort of like skills and their resources. I also think another really great website that's out there has been produced by ACON, and it's called Trans Hub. And if someone can put Trans Hub in the chat, that would be really great. And that's got resources for trans people, their family and friends, and for services that will help you and will enable you to do this sort of like broader work and form stronger and healthy relationships with the trans community. Anyone, like it's simple, like in doing sort of like prevention work, and a place where you could start if you're a prevention project is just recognizing the trans and gender diverse days of significance. And this is where you can put out like things like social media posts. It's also great places to be able to follow some of the trans organizations that are out there and share their trans content. And like we know that like Transgender Victoria's got a great Transgender Day of Visibility website that just has allyship kits and so many resources to support you in doing your prevention work, especially if you're just starting out. You might be nervous around making sure that you're getting your messaging right. And so it's really forming that sort of like partnerships with trans orgs and following their content and following their messages can be really helpful. It's also important within your work to understand what are the harms that have been caused in your sector around for trans and gender diverse people, and what are the barriers. So we know that Rainbow Health Australia and Archers did this really great sort of research in and around, Julia, I'm promoting your work here, around opening doors and around the sort of like harms that have occurred and the barriers that LGBTI people face in sort of like family, domestic and sexual violence services. There are so many sort of like guides and research out there that that can help you understand, because you've got to understand the problem before you can sort of like fix it. And there are so many sort of like resources to support you to understand what are the barriers, what are the issues for trans and gender diverse people in your area of work. And so you can sort of expand your knowledge and practice in doing that. So for people know, there's also really great guides like out there. A number of different organizations have done it within the sort of like family violence sector. We know that Vincent Care, for an example, put out a sexuality and gender diversity guide that you can sort of read. We know that there's like a national LGBTI inclusive practice in homelessness guides, and there will be many resources across many different sectors that support you doing this work. And so this is like can be one of the really big questions that that Julie was talking to, was around like inclusive practice and data collection. And so Good Shepherd also put out a guide a few years ago that might help you be able to do this work. And it's just really important, if you are a service provider, creating that sort of like safety for LGBTI people and trans and gender diverse people accessing your service. When we are thinking about sort of like data collection, it's always really important to ensure that disclosing of your LGBTIQA plus identity is optional. It's important to always explain why you're asking, understanding the history that LGBTI people have broadly experienced a lot of sort of discrimination, and they might be worried about disclosing their sort of LGBTI identity, or worried that it's being like invasive, or they might be wondering how you might manage their confidentiality and their sort of like safety. And when people are accessing your services, it's always important to communicate your anti-discrimination policies and complaints pathways. I often talk about how within service provision, sometimes, especially when we've got progressive views, we can make these assumptions of like, well, of course, I'm an inclusive and respectful person, that you're safe with me. but understanding the history of oppression and poor service provision and harm that many LGBTI people face in accessing services, it's really important that we really actively communicate our sort of anti-discrimination policies and that we are a safe and welcoming person. It might be like posters up at your resource at service. It might be wearing a pronoun badge or lanyards, ways to communicate that you are safe. But it's always important that we never make assumptions. And I guess heteronormativity is always there. It's always pervasive, even for me. And sometimes we can make assumptions, false assumptions about people's gender identity, their sexuality, or their intersex status. But we can never make assumptions. And that even if you do all of these things to create a safe and welcoming environment and invite people to disclose, some people may choose not to disclose their identity for a variety of different reasons. Another thing that we can do with, our sort of staff is developing like communication guides, and obviously Rainbow Health Australia has put out theirs, but we did one a number of years ago with CoHealth, and it is for community health services, but it can be really sort of extrapolated, and this is on our website. And it's just a communication plan of how to engage and be respectful with trans and gender diverse staff or clients. And it's really important. It includes like basic terminology, inclusive language, can be about how you can create safety for people to share their names, pronouns, or gender identity, and also about managing trans and gender diverse people's confidentiality. And most importantly, it also talks about the space of creating inclusive amenities. Sadly, I think, in particular for trans and gender diverse people, I always find like when we think about transphobia or transmisogyny, we're always really hyper-focusing on the very overt forms of discrimination, including hatred or very hateful sort of statements. But a lot of the transphobia that we experience is through othering and through microaggressions. And sometimes there's this narrative in our society of like that again is binary, and these ideas that there are two types of people, as good people and bad people, and therefore bad people discriminate and good people can't. And therefore I, as a good person, can't possibly discriminate. The people that I love and care for, my friends and family, my co-worker who I really highly respect, can't discriminate. But actually it's not about being good or bad. It's about the sort of biases that we might have picked up. And it's really important that we're able to identify, even through people that we love and respect, that we can identify where there might be sort of like biases and discriminations, and to try and call them in, to try and bring them in. Or if they're unwilling to do that, that we take a stance of going, well, unfortunately, in our service or particularly within service provision, it's unlawful to discriminate. And despite your opinions, I need you to ensure that you are respecting trans and gender diverse or LGBTI people. And that is sort of central to our work. We've also developed some other sort of like great sort of like resources. Like we've created a few years ago, we worked with the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and we created a trans and gender diverse inclusive care guide for hospitals, in particular to like manage like bed-based safety for trans and gender diverse people, or difficult or challenging conversations that trans people might have in and around their bodies, or people making assumptions about trans and gender diverse people's bodies. And I just think it's really important that we access, we share, reference, and we promote the sort of trans and gender diverse or LGBTI practice guides that are out there. As Julia said before, accessing trainings to develop your organization's sort of inclusive practice, but also I think what is really important, the consulting and partnering with LGBTI and trans and gender diverse people. I can't tell you, like in the last few years, there has been this significant shift within women's services and within gender-based violence sector broadly of being trans and gender diverse inclusive, and that those organizations, we're tiny. We have got no resources, like hardly any resources. Last year we nearly collapsed because we were so poorly funded, and we had like Safe and Equal step up and give us a year's funding to cover my wage so that we continue to do this work. And it's really important. If you're a larger organization, you might have a lot of resources to work with, to platform and to share, and to invest some of your resources in to sort of create equity for the LGBTI or trans and gender diverse sector that might be much less resource than where you are. And lastly, just sort of like closing off, one of the really sort of like important things within the workplace, I just think we need to be employing, we need to be training, we need to be building the capacity of the trans and gender diverse workforce. We have a right to sort of like equitable like employment, but also we have so much talent and skill to add to this sector, in particular in prevention and violence prevention. But often our workplaces haven't really thought about creating safety for us in that. And one of the things you could do is create sort of gender affirmation policies. So either your existing staff who might be trans and gender diverse can affirm their gender identity in the workplace, or new staff coming in know that you are an organization that is going to be safe and respectful to them. And that ACON's Trans Hub has great resources to develop workplace gender affirmation plans and policies. Oops, sorry, this is a bit all over the place. It's the end of the year, I'm getting tired, but I'm still here, still bringing it. And so some of that might be around, the expected timeframes for if somebody wants to affirm their gender in the workplace. It can be about proposed leave plans, like giving trans people the right. Some trans people might want to medically affirm their gender identity. Most of that is not covered under Medicare and can come at an incredible cost to trans and gender diverse people. Giving us that gender affirming leave can be really important. Can be about creation of a support team if somebody wants that, about how and when people want it communicated to their staff or other peers, and a whole other things. And so developing that policy, creating that safe workplace for trans and gender diverse people is really important. And I think it can be like when you see discrimination that occurring, even if it's subtle, getting in early and talking to trans people about their experiences of discrimination or bias from other staff is really important. Often I see that it's left too late and it's gotten to really serious, and that might be in just including like the constant misgendering of people. And often what I see is the harm that's occurred by the time that HR has sort of stepped in means that the trans people are just like, they're going to quietly leave. They're upset, they're hurt, and too much damage has been done. And if we do that work, very early intervention within our workforces, and acknowledging prevention of violence also needs to occur in our workplace, then it can mean that trans people can contribute and can shine and can succeed in our workplaces. So thank you for today. It was really appreciated. That's the end of my presentation. It's really been really exciting here, and I'm about to go on leave to India to recharge for the summer. But I've just been really excited over the last sort of like week in working with organizations, knowing that people care, knowing that people want to move forward, and knowing the sort of like solidarity that you are all showing by turning up and by committing to this work is just incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Starlady. That was wonderful. You gave us such a lot to think about. Oh, it is the end of year. Tech is going a bit haywire. I'm glad you came and shared that information with us before you do go off on your well-deserved break. That was wonderful. I can't wait to go back and watch the recording, and to remind anyone if they've missed anything, it's documented and you can go and watch as many times as you like. We are about to do the inevitable evaluation after that wonderful, wonderful talk from Starlady. Now, this evaluation is super important, but before we get there, there's a lot probably going on in your heads right now, and so I hope you're feeling encouraged. I hope you're feeling hopeful. And think about that as you fill in the survey and tell us what you think. We're going to give you a minute to get started. You can scan the QR code or use that link and click the link in the chat. Some love for you in the chat. Amazing Starlady, Julia and Ellen, you all rock. And that is from our CEO here at WHLM. And just a reminder for anyone who is watching this recording after today, you can also fill in the evaluation, and we strongly encourage you to do so. Thank you. Now, don't go away, everyone, because we're still going to get a final word from our panelists before we wrap up today. We've got 6 minutes left, so we will invite Starlady and Julia and Ellen to give us something to think about as we close this session for our 16 days webinar this year, Preventing Gender-Based Violence Beyond the Binary. Let's start, we'll give you a break. You've done a lot of talking, Starlady. So let's start with you, Julia. Your hot tip for our participants moving forward.
Thanks, Gabrielle. I think for those of you who are not part of the LGBTIQA community, I think my main tip is to consume queer content. You know, follow LGBTIQ organizations, watch movies by and about queer and trans folks, read books. You don't have to wait until your organization pays for you to go to formal training to kind of start learning more about our people and our communities. And I think that like LGBTIQA people are by default defying these rigid gender categories. And I guess it's an invitation to kind of be excited by what's possible. You know, like we're the original experts at resisting rigid gender norms. And you can learn so much through just like the accounts that you follow and the kind of literature that you read. And I guess it's kind of like it's fun homework. And it also, I guess, to draw on it from it, you know, some of the training that we deliver about supporting people to be more inclusive in their workplaces. There is this biological function in us that happens that's innate, that we react abrasively or coldly or awkwardly sometimes when we're talking to people who are different to us. And that, you know, is a kind of primal function that is contributed to by the rigid gender norms and stuff that we're all exposed to. But you can override that through reducing this sense of kind of newness that you might have with, like, I remember the first few times that I was talking to trans people, I was really self-conscious. I was like, don't be weird, Julia, but I could tell that I was being weird, you know? Like, and so I think that partly it's partly through exposure that you kind of get used to people who are different to you. And that's a really important kind of first step in order to actually be able to be a more inclusive and affirming person. And that will really support you in your prevention efforts.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Julia. Ellen.
Down. I was thinking my top tip is, I guess, to get to all the places and spaces and people that we need to reach to shift the dial on the problem, the problem of violence in our communities. There's no way that we can get there without partnerships. So partnerships between mainstream and LGBTIQ organisations and activists is really, really, really key. And you know, just to reiterate what Julia and Starlady was saying earlier around allyship and making mistakes and learning from them is something, you know, just from my positionality, just absolutely saying yes, that's what we do. We make mistakes, we take the next step forward, and that's and we also need to be really reflective of our power in this work as mainstream organisations, and thinking critically about how money and influence is shared, as Starlady was speaking to, and who has access to decision makers, who makes decisions, and this is an ongoing commitment and an ongoing practice. It's not a once-off thing that we tick the box on and can move on. So yeah, they're my reflections.
I'm going to thank you, Alan and Julie. I'm just going to talk about like one of my cute wins for the sort of year was like, I remember like earlier this year, Respect Victoria came to me and they're like, hey, You know, we want to create a post and a blog around addressing men's violence against trans women. We've read all your resources. We've seen your webinars. Here's the post. Here's the blog. What do you think? And I think I almost cried because it was just like, oh, I just felt so relieved. I'm like, you went and did the work. I didn't have to do it. You integrated it. It wasn't perfect, but it was, it was like almost there. And I'm like, just tweak it here and here. And they did it. I didn't have to do it. And I just thought that's about like justice. That's the justice that our community needs. And, they're on a learning journey. Many organizations are on a learning journey, but I just loved their commitment to the work and that they had taken that up. And that meant a lot to us. Yeah. So go out there, have a go.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining the conversation today. Go out there, have a go. We can change the story, Loddon Mallee, together and beyond. Thanks to our wonderful panelists, Starlady, Julia Earley from Rainbow Health Australia, and Ellen Poyner from Our Watch. Thank you to our Auslan interpreters for keeping up with us and for your expertise and time today. You will receive a follow-up email with the recording and all these amazing resources that we're so lucky to have. Keep the conversation going, everyone, and that's a wrap. Thank you.